You're listening to Unmuted Love. Hi there, I'm C. Ushelman, and with 35 years as a marriage and family therapist and 25 years as a parent of 2 children I brought home from the foster care system, I want to welcome you here to Unmuted Love Podcast, the one place where nothing is off limits to say out loud about parenting children from difficult beginnings.
Stop for a minute, stop and breathe for a minute, long it over your head, try to listen instead, won't you? Think for a minute, who you want to be for a minute, don't get over your head, you're like everyone else, aren't you?
Sometimes it's real sweet around here, and sometimes it ain't so pretty, because this is 100% Unmuted Love. So let's go.
You'll be just
Hey parents, this is C. Get the help you need to end destructive and chaotic behavior in your home while parenting children from difficult beginnings. I know you need help, and the Love Plus parenting model actually works. I'm inviting you to work with me personally for 6 months in my virtual therapeutic parent program, and I guarantee you results, or 100% of your investment back. How is that for a blue ribbon deal? I'm looking forward to working with you. See you on the inside. So today the topic is supporting neurodiversity in children and youth, and it's part 1 because I'm not actually going to talk about parenting today. I'm going to talk about what is neurodiversity, and parenting will be in part 2. So we're just going to look at definitions and challenges of autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and other disorders like sensory processing disorder and learning differences and commonalities. Because there are a lot of commonalities. We're also going to talk about trauma and how those tend to mimic some of these, and it's very hard to parse them out, like which is what, right? And so a lot of times parents of children and even therapists go hunting for better labels, ever better labels. Like, what is this? What am I looking at? What's it called? What diagnosis is it? Is it this? Is it that? And then there's this kind of ongoing search that can be sort of mind-boggling. For me as a parent, I just want to know how to parent. And there are so many similarities in these things that you can pretty much parent similarly and do well. There are a few differences, which I'm going to talk about. But first of all, let's get our terminology clear. Neurodiversity versus neurodivergent. What's the difference between those two words? What I want you to know is that neurodiversity is a social justice, inclusion, and equality label, basically. It's people saying human beings are neurodiverse, right? We are all different. All of our brains are different. Everyone alive has a brain, and all brains are different from one another. Because there are more brains alike in one category, we call those people neurotypical or typical. And so some people would say normal, that's gone out of fashion, so we call it neurotypical now. While there are a lot of people in a neurodiverse population that are similar and neurotypical, the neurodiversity movement is really about being inclusive and creating equity everywhere so that we don't look at it as normal and abnormal. We look at brain differences as all part of the neurodiversity. That's an important distinction. It's significant to some people. And so you can kind of get into a little bit of what am I supposed to say? How am I supposed to talk about this? So that's why I'm taking a little bit of time to share it with you. So what is neurodivergent? Well, neurodivergent is about one person. So you would say Sarah is a neurodivergent child, or you could say Sarah's a child with autism. Sarah is neurodivergent with ADHD, for example. Neurodivergence is always talking about one person, and neurodiversity is talking about everybody. And so you would call Sarah neurodivergent. You wouldn't call Sarah neurodiverse, because that would be not a correct languaging. It's really a grammar thing, but it's more than a grammar thing. So I wanted to point out to you how it is more than a grammar thing. So people who are neurodivergent have some and not all characteristics in common. Thus, autism is considered a spectrum from mild, moderate to severe. There are differences in ADHD children, for example, or children who have ADHD, and there are significant differences in children who are neurodivergent in that from trauma, they may have symptoms that look like autism, that look like ADHD, that look like sensory processing disorder, and probably are. But it's important to realize that trauma mimics all those. And they can, of course, coexist. It's important because sometimes people who have kids who've been through difficult beginnings run around fiercely trying to find labels that will fit when really what they have are children who've experienced trauma. And trauma has to be treated. But the difference between neurodivergent people and children who are traumatized is that, in theory, if you're neurodivergent, you are always neurodivergent, right? Your brain is always neurodivergent. And if you have trauma, the implication is that you can get better from trauma. But the truth is, trauma literally changes the DNA. It actually is an organic difficulty with the brain. It's a brain difference. So kids who have experienced trauma are neurodivergent. And so there's a little bit of a conflict in the politics of all of this, where people might say to you, well, they're not neurodivergent just because they have trauma. The truth is, they do, under the actual definition of neurodivergent, which is organic brain change difference, right? They do qualify for that. So I like to think of kids who have experienced trauma as neurodivergent because they do need to be parented similarly to all these other kids that fall into this category. I realized when I started to talk about this, it's like, yeah, this is a really highly charged, highly political conversation. And I wanted to make it simple and not too theoretical, but also where it's useful for you to actually be able to use the terminology fairly easily and to be able to advocate for your children when they're neurodivergent. You know, there'll be a lot of changes as we grow and understand the brain better, because this is like a hot world that's being explored wildly, the brain. Because it's everything, right? It's a brain thing. And without your brain, there's not much going on. There's a lot of studying going on and a lot of research going on. So I'm sure that this is a moment in time, and it will change pretty drastically, probably in the next 10 years. So let's look at neurodiversity, right? It's not everything, obviously, because like we just noted, right? Downs is not in here. And it's not neurotypical, right? Down syndrome is not neurotypical. So it really probably should come in here. So autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, FASD, which is fetal alcohol syndrome, OCD, Tourette's syndrome, sensory processing disorder, learning differences and trauma, and then neurotypical. So the diversity is everything, and the neurodivergent are the individuals in the categories. Because neurotypicals have a lot of things in common, very similar to one another, that's the group that gets labeled as normal. And this movement is working very hard to be inclusive. Instead of seeing one group as normal and everybody else trying to be normal, or trying to get all these other people to be more normal, instead look at accommodation. The neurodiversity movement is looking at accommodation and inclusiveness rather than trying to behaviorally get all these folks to fall into line under the neurotypical category. You know this, it's all a brain thing. Life is a brain thing. And the push here is to let's learn to be inclusive, empathic, and accommodating to the neurodiversity of us all, right? Because even amongst neurotypical people, there are differences in brains, right? There's intelligence differences, there's access to information differences. There's a lot of differences in what we would call neurotypical. And so everybody comes in under this umbrella. I think it's a lovely thing, and it would be great if we moved away from stigmatizing folks who learn differently, folks who have different brain structure from the neurotypical group. Common challenges of neurodivergent children actually they fall into three categories, right? The social function, academics, and emotional. And they have a lot of things in common. If you have children who have different labels, you're going to see that their difficulties fall in these same categories. So children experiencing neurodivergence often have difficulty making and keeping friends, taking turns, waiting in line, sharing, understanding social cues, body space, personal needs, being empathic. That makes them stand out in a neurotypical crowd. But if you were accommodating them, you would just be inclusive and allow for the differences and to not be trying to get them to fit into something that their brain is different than. And they could fit in if they wanted to, but they don't have to. Academics, children experiencing neurodivergence, are challenged by school settings. Sensory environment of it is difficult. How many children are in those environments, the busyness of it, the expectation of it. So they generally need an individualized education plan, and learning differences are huge and need accommodation in the neurodivergent population. And then the emotional arena, right? Children experiencing neurodivergence commonly have difficulty managing their emotions. They have trouble with emotion regulation. And they often have big outbursts, big demands, refusals, shutdowns, and running away, just to name a few. Keep in mind that autism, OCD, ADHD, Tourette's, all of those are very spectrumy. There's a big difference in person to person diagnosed with neurodivergence right in there. There can be a spectrum, right? So from what we used to call Asperger's in autism, we don't have that diagnosis anymore. The difference between a kid who was diagnosed with Asperger's and a kid who was diagnosed with autism spectrum might be significantly different, where the ASD kid might be able to go and work and be in other environments and have jobs that appear neurotypical, while the others may not be able to do that. If we had a more inclusive world, a more inclusive environment, then there would be a place for everybody, right? We would make room. So, autism spectrum disorder. These are rough. They don't apply to everybody, but these are the categories where the characteristics that you might see in a person with autism would be unusual play patterns, playing alone or side by side and not moving in the direction of playing interactively, difficulty in social interaction, communication differences, repetitive behaviors, and special interests. So sometimes a child with autism might have repetitive behaviors with their body. They might do flapping, they might do stim, and that is just a repetitive behavior that they do. It doesn't mean they're crazy. It doesn't mean something's wrong with them. It's just part of how they soothe themselves. Also, they may get special interests where they're highly focused and highly informed about a specific thing. So I have a child on the spectrum who I'm pretty sure for the first 6 years only said the word car and only noticed cars and never really had any other toys, never thought about anything but cars. It was pretty intense about cars, let me just say. The interesting thing is that over time, he has changed, right? Now he's fixated on other things, so he has no interest in cars anymore. So I found that funny because it was like, oh gosh, if I have to talk about cars one more second, I'm going to cry. Also in this category would be rigidity and resistance to change. What that means is routines are really important. They often like to know what to expect. They want to know what's going to happen. They want to have routines that they can follow, and they have a hard time with transitions. And so that's what resistance to change means. It means that they have difficulty transitioning because they don't want to. They want to stay in one place and feel safe there, right? Feel predictable, feel like they have safety in that particular routine, whatever it is. And then finally, sensory sensitivities. Often children with autism are highly sensitive to environments. And they often have a hard time being around a lot of people, being around new people, making friends in groups. A lot of that has to do with getting touched, people being too close to them, too much noise, and even sometimes the olfactory, the odors of people can be overwhelming. So in my humble opinion, the only reason to chase a label would be to get a label that gives you extra resources, because everybody needs extra resources. And autism happens to have a really good political group behind them. And so they get the most attention and therefore they have the most money, right? And so they actually have a funding stream to support children with autism. And it's unfortunate because they're all kids who are neurodiverse, actually all kids, but neurodiverse kids in particular really need a lot of supports. And they're not much different from children with autism. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of intervention that's often given to kids with autism. That is ABA, it's Applied Behavioral Analysis. And the proponents of it say this, that they are individualized and tailored interventions for each child so that the child has unique strengths and needs This is the modern day version of ABA because ABA is not known for these things, but there has been a push recently in broadening their awareness so that they're more inclusive, they're less behavioral and more relational over time. They're data-driven and evidence-based, so they collect a lot of data. Behavioral programs are always big on data, which is nice. They focus on functional skills, so skills to promote independence. And that's one of the things that a lot of people want, but sometimes to get that with a child who has autism, it's to train and teach like ad nauseum, right? Just train to get functional skills, when maybe that's not necessary. Maybe there's another way, or they don't need to be browbeaten that way. I don't think they're browbeaten, but it feels like it. If you've ever spent a lot of time in an ABA center, it feels a little bit intense, right? Just a whole lot of behavioral management. Promotion of positive behaviors. And so again, you see that ABA is a little bit outside the neurodiversity world, right? The neurodiversity world says be inclusive and allow these differences to coexist. And ABA says, let's make everybody a little more neurotypical so that they can fit in. That's a huge difference, right, between neurodiversity and ABA. Now, they've changed a lot in the last 10 years. I want to just say that, but let me talk a little bit about what critics say. So with ABA, ethical concerns come up. Like they used to really use aversive techniques, like if you do this, I'm going to snap a rubber band on your hand, or if you do this, I'm going to give you a negative reinforcement, right? Those are aversive things to get children to perform tasks that were more, quote, neurotypical. So I'm trying to show both sides of this because I know ABA is trying to change, but it's not oriented toward neurodiversity. It's oriented more towards normalization. That focus on compliance and normalization was seen as, really bending toward neurotypical and not accepting the differences in different groups, right? And so, for example, a child with, even though I'm talking about autism, a child with ADHD, for example, there's really no room for an ADHD kid in a regular classroom. It's really hard because they're busy, right? They're busy. If they have combined type, they have a hard time paying attention. They have inattention and they have busyness, right? Restlessness and impulsivity. So there's a lot going on. Very hard for them to sit in a classroom hour on end. Because we do the kind of group setting we do in teaching, they are seen as disruptive when really they're just who they are. And so kids, for example, with autism or with ADHD get labeled as, I hope he's not in my class. I hope I don't have to deal with that, instead of figuring out how to accommodate those differences. And it's really hard. It's hard the way our education system is, but it can be done. Just have to change it, right? Make it smaller, give more accommodation to those kids who need that kind of one-on-one education. So the critics also say there's lack of individuation because it's all moving toward neurotypical rather than just allowing them to be how they are and develop their own strengths. Excessive demand for compliance, right? So we talked about that. Focus on compliance and behavioral control. There are people who that was done to who have matured and they have a lot of things to say about what happened to them because it felt abusive back when they were really being strict about it. And so the parental concerns are just those. There are some more critical things, and it comes down to money. Put some money in these educational environments that really focus on the actual children who are there, like who's really there. Not everybody's not neurotypical and, compliant. So anyway, there's limited generalization, focuses on surface behaviors rather than root causes or on emotional dysregulation. Long-term sustainability, like when they're not in that highly reinforced environment, then they might lose their skills, or when the environment changes, they don't have that heavily reinforced environment. It may not hold, basically. Limited emphasis on autonomy and self-advocacy. They're not being taught to speak out and advocate for themselves, to be accommodated. And it's expensive. I think nowadays almost anybody can get ABA services, though. Not as long perhaps as they need it, but definitely they can get it for autism. But there are alternatives. So when we're going to talk about not ABA in the parenting part, we're going to talk about therapeutic parenting and how to use it in order to maintain the relationship with the child and to not destroy their sense of who they are and their internal working model, right? Is like sense of self, sense of being good. Kids who are neurodivergent are very sensitive to being seen as bad, because they're often in trouble, because they're not as compliant, because they can't be. And there's a difference between can't and won't, right? So if you can't be compliant, then you shouldn't be getting in trouble for popping up and down in your chair or blurting out something. Or frankly, if you have Tourette's, saying fuck out loud in a classroom, because you can't help it. You can have some interventions that can help, but you shouldn't be in trouble for those behaviors because they're not in your control until you learn how to have them in your control. And usually that requires maturity. We just need more people, right? More people, more bodies, trained bodies, people who understand what they're looking at and who are not punitive. Being punitive is traditional parenting. It was traditional ABA too. It doesn't help all these kids, it hurts them. And so being therapeutic so that you're not punishing, you can get behavior change without punishment, making the child feel like they are being bad, moving their clip down to the bottom or turning over the red card or whatever it is, right? Sort of like social shaming. It's really hard if you can't manage your ADHD symptoms and you get a red card turned over every day. What does that do to who you think you are? And then how does that help them stay in the classroom and do really anything? They can't do it better. So we're really just punishing them for who they are. It's hard. I mean, I have all kinds of empathy for the situation, right? Teachers are handcuffed and administrators are too. There's just not enough money to make the class sizes realistic for the amount of trauma and the amount of neurodivergence there is, right? It's a huge problem and we haven't really addressed it at all. So let's jump on into ADHD. So there used to be something called ADD that was considered to be inattention disorder, but now they're all together with ADHD. So you have to have a cutout, right? If you just have inattention versus the full combined type, which is inattention means you're easily distracted. You have a hard time with busy rooms. You have a hard time focusing. You are sometimes off task because it's hard for you to focus your attention. Impulsivity is where you have a hard time managing your impulses, right? And when you have a thought, you act on it instantly. And, your mouth is going really fast, talking a lot, chattering a lot. Hyperactive kids are chattering a lot, talking a lot, moving a lot, needing actually to express their body energy. The impulsivity is that way too. I think a lot of kids who have ADHD also have sensory processing disorder. Also with autism, sensory processing disorder tends to go hand in hand there. Kids with ADHD have executive function challenges. The executive function is right here, your prefrontal cortex, and it's where all your more mature behaviors are. So your judgment, your wait time, your organization, your moral reasoning. Yeah, so your sense of right and wrong, right? It's in your executive function. And kids with ADHD in studies have actually smaller brains than children who would be considered neurotypical. So there's something going on there, right, that's neurodivergent about their brain size. It is different. It's not 100%, but it's pretty close. It's really high. And then they have social emotional difficulties. And that's partly because they're in trouble all the time. And they've been in trouble since they were born, practically, right? Since they could walk, because they were getting into stuff and they were jumping off of things and they were running out into the street and they were throwing stuff and going through grocery stores like Mad Hatters, right? So they're in trouble a lot and they end up with a lot of social emotional difficulties just from the environment that they're in. And then they have impulsivity. So impulsivity mixed with hyperactivity is really quite something in a group, right? You're dominating the group. You have a hard time taking turns. You want to go first. You can be kind of bossy and in charge. And that creates social difficulties for other children with you. And then that very common emotion dysregulation that is a thread that runs through all of these things. Neurodivergent people have emotion regulation issues almost 100%. just is what it is. And so when you talked about learning regulation strategies and all of that, I mean, it's true. You do have to learn all those things to even slightly get by in the world, because there is no room for melting down and blowing out everywhere you go. So the strategies that work with ADHD generally would be creating consistent routines, lots of physical activity. When you are asking for them to concentrate, you need to take frequent move breaks. Sometimes a strategy for smaller children, maybe do 10 or 15 minutes of school and then they run around the table a few times, right? And then sit back down. So that's really helpful. It's just a small little strategy. And when you have younger kids, they think that's funny, right? To run around the table. But that actually is regulating. That physical activity is very regulating. And that's just one solution. You could also actually let them out and let them go and play on a playground and get their wiggles out. So frequent breaks, way more frequent than you might imagine, and compassion for how hard it is for them to actually sit still and do that. Another strategy is to minimize distractions. Obviously, if they have inattention, they are easily, it's like squirrel, right? Squirrel. They are busy getting distracted by everything. They need clear instructions and they need clear organizational strategies. I can't tell you how many parents talk to me about this one particular behavior. She does her homework, but she never hands it in. He does his homework, but he never hands it in. This is like, it makes parents crazy because they're doing their part, which is to ensure that the homework's getting done, but it can't get from the backpack to the teacher for some reason. So things like that, organizational strategies and methodologies for, like, an accommodation would be for the teacher to ask for it. But of course, teachers ask for it, like, just put it over here in the basket when you come in through the door, like a routine. Some kids can do that, but often they just can't remember to do it. Positive reinforcement, regulation practices, open communication, and keeping the relationship. The relationship with kids who experience ADHD gets broken a lot around how difficult it is to parent children who are, what we might call kind of off the hook. They're just busy, and they're busy 24/7. They're not just busy sometimes. They're very busy. Now, they can get something called hyperfocus, where they just zone in on something and they stay fixated on that and zoned in, a little bit like the autism spectrum kids. There's that hyper focus that can happen. But then what happens is you can't get them away from it, right? They have emotion dysregulation when you try to break their high focus. Boundaries are really important. The way you establish boundaries is by setting a limit and having repetition. And, parents hate repetition. I've told you 40 times to put your backpack over here. The truth is, it takes 400 repetitions to create a new neural pathway for a neurotypical person. Imagine how many repetitions it takes for a child experiencing ADHD. They're only hearing part of things. That's one of the things that I know, is that they only hear like the first couple of words and the last couple of words and miss the middle often. And so they're really good at saying, yeah, I know, because they got the first 3 words and the last 3 words, but there's more in the middle that they didn't get. So they often only do one chore, or one chore here and one chore there, but the third thing that was in the middle, it's like it didn't happen. And then fostering independence. Most kids with ADHD want to be independent, but they are dangerous to themselves and others. And so they have to be well boundaried and they have to be well supervised before they get independence, because they often can't manage the independence that they have. And then the last thing is limited screen time, which goes for all kids. All kids should have very limited screen time, because it does to the brain what it doesn't look like it's doing to the brain, right? So it's revving up the brain even though the child looks calm. And that's the hard part, right? Because if you have a highly active child and the thing that calms them down is their tablet in front of them, and you are exhausted because they've talked to you for the last 4 hours, or they've run around the house doing this, doing that, doing everything, and your nerves are fried, then that tablet seems like a really good idea, right? Because it gets quiet in the house and it calms it down, but it's not calming down the brain. It's actually revving it up. So besides being shut down, often kids get angry. right? They become angry, and then you get a lot of acting out and a lot of hatred and a lot of what looks like aggression and abuse, when really they're just stuffing so much stuff all the time. They're just stuffing it. And then, like a volcano, it just comes out. And then you can actually misparent it for long enough or mistreat it long enough where it just becomes a permanent condition of just having a chip on their shoulder and being defensive and refuting everything and being reactive to everything. Okay, so let's talk about sensory processing disorder. This is an interesting disorder. I have it. And I have it in a mild way, I think, but my kids both had it in like very severe ways, and they were kind of in trouble a lot around their sensory issues in the beginning, before I knew about therapeutic parenting, because they would say they're doing something, but they had that I can't hear all the words in the sentence. And when they did chores, they did them like the worst ever. They could clean counters, and the counter would be just as dirty as when they started because their proprioception was off. There were lots of things like that would just, like before it was diagnosed, I didn't know what it was, right? Once I knew what it was, it became so much easier to parent that because you understood why it was happening. I didn't understand why it was happening. So with sensory processing disorder, almost all, including trauma, almost all kids with trauma, autism, ADHD, Tourette's, they have the sensory processing or integration issues. So they often have oversensitivity, right? They're very over responsive to stimuli. So noisy environments, busy environments, colorful environments, busy rooms, cluttered rooms, things like that can just ignite them, just set them off. Under responsivity is when they don't notice things in their environment, or they don't notice when they're being overwhelmed by things, and they don't even notice their own the pressure if you hurt them, right? If you hold too tight, or if they get injured, they often can tolerate a high level of injury because they don't recognize it as a sense. Some kids have sensory seeking, where they need a high level of stimulation and they seek it out, and it is calming to them, right? So they're constantly seeking that in order to calm themselves. So they're very active. They're very involved in kinesthetic behavior and monkey bar kind of behavior, right? Just moving around upside down, jumping off of things, running off of things. I mean, sensory seeking kids have a very high level of fear for parents, right? Parents are scared for them because they are high level risk takers, and they don't really know it, right? They're just seeking to soothe their body. That's what they're doing. They often have difficulty with sensory integration, discomfort, or disorganization in certain environments, which I already said, but they can also have trouble with things like little things like clothing, right? They can lose their minds around clothing that it doesn't feel right, or shoes that are too tight or too loose, or if you have them wear a hat, that can be just horrible to them, like a warm hat. So there are lots of sensory problems around clothing where kids melt down every single morning, right? Trying to get dressed for school because it doesn't feel right. It doesn't fit right, or it feels bad. That's what I have. I have meltdowns every morning. No, I have trouble with tags and clothing. I like really big clothing and big shoes because when they're fit right, people are always like, why do you wear such big clothes? And I'm like, well, because they don't squeeze me. Like, I don't want to be squeezed by my clothes because it makes me mad. I feel mad, and I don't want to feel mad. I'm wildly irritated. So I know what these little guys feel like, because there are times when I could just be sitting still, like in my office, being irritated to death by the smallest little something in my shirt. Like the smallest little something. And I'm just like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my mind. Sometimes I just have to, I close my door and take my clothes off to find it. Where is it? I got to find it. I got to get it out. And then I think I've gotten it out and I put it back on and it's still there. So who knows? It's so crazy. But it's so painful. Like, I experience it as painful. So it's irritating, painful. It makes me tired. By the end of the day, every day, when I have to wear like dress-up clothes, I'm just exhausted by it because they squeeze me. Because dress-up clothes, tend to be tighter. I just can't do it. So I made a rule that I'll only work in my office if I can wear jeans and big shirts. Loose-fitting jeans, big shoes, and loose shirts. So that made my environment much better for me, so that I didn't have to feel so exhausted coming home at the end of the day. Often their motor coordination and balance is off. They have trouble with that. That is their vestibular integration issue, right? Where you know where you are. So kids who have vestibular issues, often you'll find them spinning, because that's very soothing to them. And then, of course, the same thing, emotional and behavioral responses, because when you're irritated or you're annoyed by your clothes or you're exhausted or any of those things, right, you're going to have emotional dysregulation and behavioral responses to it. I even have them. And I'm a grown-up, like there are times when I'm like, I just got to close this door and take my clothes off. I mean, that's weird in your office, but I have done that more than once, because I just needed to get them off. I promise you I put them back on before I saw my next client. That would be something, wouldn't it? So create a sensory-friendly environment if you have an SPD kid. Develop a daily sensory diet. Someone mentioned that. Regulation tools are everything. We'll talk about this in the parenting, but empathy is everything. So many kids are in so much trouble, right, for all of these neurodivergent reasons. And it's so unfair for them, right, because they really can't. It's not that they won't, but they get seen as they won't, and then they're in trouble. So high empathy is required for all these kids because they are suffering, a lot of them, and they are unable to manage it a lot. So giving them a lot of regulation tools that are fun, visual supports that are just more fun to look at, like pictures rather than words, give choice and control. I'm always helping parents, like, it's okay, let them go to school in whatever feels good. It doesn't matter if it's been worn 3 days in a row. I mean, really, it doesn't matter. Like, that's okay. It feels good for some reason. That's why it's being worn every day. Allowing them much more freedom around things that maybe we have opinions about, or we don't want our kid to be seen like, Bozo the Clown with shoes that are 2 sizes too big, but that's what's necessary. So it's okay. So deep pressure or proprioception, I can't say it, input. Deep pressure is often really good, but again, it's all unique to the child. So you have to see what works for them. So pillow squishes, being squished by a pillow. I used to lay on my kids all the time. They liked me laying on them. I put pillows on top of them and then lay on them. They love that. Sensory breaks. We talked about that. Individualized approach, gradual exposure to things. So sometimes kids have food issues because of sensory issues. And so they need to be gradually exposed to different textures, different colors, different flavors. And there's a lot to it. And if you have a super duper sensory disordered child who has eating issues, then you really need also a specialist in that arena. When you start having children who have cognitive awareness, often they are impulsive and they do things out of their suffering, whatever their suffering is. The only way to work with them is through relationship and collaboration. Imposing some kind of punishment or some kind of sit on the bench, sitting on the bench at recess as a consequence for not doing well in the classroom is a really bad idea because they need to run around. Those kids need to run around and get their wiggles out. If they sit on the bench at recess, they'll come back in the classroom and be doubly difficult. And so collaboration would look like, how do you feel after you hit the teacher? And then often they'll say, I feel terrible. I don't want to be like this, And then great. That's buy-in. Great. Let's work together to change it. And so then you come up with safety plans. You come up with sensory plans, sensory diet plans. You accommodate them so that when they start getting hot under the collar in some way, you know what the behaviors are. You talk about it with them, and then you establish that this is the time where you get to go to Miss, Jones's room and take a break from the classroom, right? Just really a lot of accommodations that have to do with it's okay to remove yourself in a safe way somewhere so that you don't continue to be upregulated, right? Dysregulated. So collaboration's everything. Without relationship and collaboration, you're going to get anger and refusal and outbursts. And that doesn't work for anybody. Now that brings me to trauma characteristics. And this is does this look familiar? Kids who were traumatized young have emotional responses. They are easily dysregulated. They have behavioral issues because they are easily dysregulated. They have cognitive and mental health issues that they're dealing with all the time. And their prefrontal cortex goes offline when they're dysregulated. So they don't learn at the same rate as other children who do not have trauma. They are dysmature and they are dysregulated, those two things. And so they can't absorb information necessarily because they might be sitting there in a classroom or sitting there in your home with toxic stress. And toxic stress is when cortisol floods the prefrontal cortex, effectively taking it offline. And that's where all the learning occurs, right? That's where your maturity is. It's where all the executive function is. And so if it gets flooded with cortisol, your memory goes offline and you are unable to recall what you already know and you can't put in new information. And so then you're just on imprint, right? And if you grew up in a household, even if it's under 2 where there was hitting, that's what you're going to do because that's your imprint. So there's a lot that is a brain function that kids don't even know about, right? They don't even know how they got this, but they got it. Kids with trauma also experience the same thing with sensory processing. They have physical symptoms and they have social and interpersonal challenges because they're easily dysregulated. They have a hard time making and keeping friends. They have an internal working model that says that they're not good, others aren't good, the world is bad, because bad things have happened to them too young. And they didn't develop an internal working model, which is how I feel about self. And they don't develop a very good model about how they feel about close others because the close others usually harmed them. So their internal working models do not work very well. And so they tend to be negativistic and victimized and often collapse in their victimization or act out in order to not be victimized, right? So there's a lot that goes on with trauma. And then, of course, because of that dysmaturity, then you get academic and functional impairments. Doesn't that sound like all the other things that we've been talking about, right? This is neurodivergence because trauma mimics ADHD. It mimics some forms of autism. It mimics OCD sometimes. I mean, there's a lot. So in sensory, almost all kids with trauma, early trauma, have sensory processing issues. What Dan Siegel says is what fires together, wires together. So that's how come sometimes the physical and the emotional get kind of bound up together. And so that's why kids with trauma need to go run and are really active and behaviorally seeking things, right? Because they got wired that way during trauma. And that's going to be it for today. So I just want you to know that Love Matters Parenting Society is a membership where there are lots of really great parents in there, and it's not terribly expensive. So I would encourage you, if you feel lonely or alone, or you would just like to have a community of people who get you and your unique family, this is a good place to go. And then, of course, my book.
Stop for a minute. Stop and breathe for a minute. Long it over your head. Try to listen instead, won't you? Think for a minute. Who you want to be for a minute. Don't get over your head. You're like everyone else, aren't you? You could gain from being a bit nicer.
The Unmuted Love podcast is hosted by me, C. Eshelman, Attachment and Trauma Specialist at the Attach Place in Sacramento, California. Our podcast producer is the amazing Saya Clark, and our theme song is Nicer by Houses on the Hill, licensed through Epidemic Sound. Thank you for being such loyal listeners here on Unmuted Love. I'll see you all next week.
You'll be just fine.